You're listening to the Vint Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast, a production of the Vint Marketplace, your source for the top wines and spirits of the world at vintmarketplace.com. Billy, I'm glad we got this sorted out because no one knew we were a wine podcast for a long time. And so it's good now that we are a Vint Wine Podcast so that when people are searching for their new favorite drive to work show, they can actually find us. It only took 4 years. Well, coming up on 4 years for us to do this.
Yeah, it's a long time coming, but thank you for everybody who has found us. We've gained a lot of loyal listeners over the years, but the other day I was just Googling top wine podcasts and Google gave me literally like 50 results that did not include us. So I was thinking about it and yeah, it's good as the time. Also to make sure that people can find us, if you haven't already, please sure to give us 5 stars on whatever platform you listen to. That always helps us get in front of folks too, but I'm happy that we're clear about what we talk about now.
Yeah, it's the niche, underground, poorly titled stuff that ends up blowing up in the end. I feel like it's probably a rocket ship from here for the Vint Podcast.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I'm very excited to now be a co-host on a wine podcast. It's been a lifelong dream of mine. And with that, we have some exciting news. We have an exciting guest, a friend of the program today. And I had one wine that I had been looking for a bottle of, from one of 2 producers for a while that I was able to acquire this weekend. That was pretty fun as well. Did not get it on the Vint Marketplace, but that doesn't mean we won't have it anytime soon. But that was fun too.
Nice. So I did something I rarely ever do last night, and I made a cocktail. So that's probably the first time I made a cocktail for myself in over 2 years. I had to go buy like whatever soda water is. Apparently soda water and sparkling water are not the same thing, but they can be used the same way. It was but it turned out it was fine. I'll probably just stick to taking the cork out and pouring the glass in the future, but
nice. Yeah. Well, I bought a wine in Umbria. There's this region. They're most known for growing Sagrantino, this really big red tannic grape, but they also grow various types of Trebbiano. And one of them is called Spoletino. And traditionally the Spoletino and other places in Italy, other grapes were grown using trees as their trellising, as their like pergolas, as their support. So they would grow the vine next to the bottom and let it climb up like it would naturally do if it was left in the wild. Then the grapes would just hang off the branches. So there's a few producers, or 2, one is Tabarini and one is Paolo Bay, that are still making wine from grapes that have climbed up these trees in this certain way. And I was going to a restaurant this week. I saw one of those bottles on their wine list. They didn't actually end up having it, but that led me to search of where I might be able to possibly find a bottle. And I was able to locate one here in Los Angeles and went and snagged it this weekend. So I'm pretty excited to try that at some point. It's the Paolo Bay Arboreus. So it's made from the grapes that big vine climbed up the tree, hung down, and they're distinctly Spoletino because apparently they have a big bulge at the top. They kind of come down and narrow, and then they have a bifurcated. You can read about it in Camuto's book, South of Somewhere, which is where I first heard about these. And this one was made in an orange wine style, the Arboreus. So it's a 2015. It's already 10 years old and not sure when I will drink it, but I'm sure it'll continue to age and pretty pumped on that. I think everybody, if they ever see any of these wines, they're made in very small quantities, should check them out.
Yeah, it says trained up trees, vines are up to 130 years old on pre-phylloxera rootstock.
Yeah, pretty cool. So they've expanded the for Spoletino. So there's a big beef, especially from Tabarini, if you read in that book, complaining about how a lot of people are calling Spoletino when it's not actually the traditional stuff or the good stuff. Keep an eye out for that, but those are 2 producers to look for. And then otherwise, I have 2 bits of news. Now, one is more wine business, so I want to save that for a second, but one is actually from an older article. It was not in the wine news this week, and somehow I found it. It was from October, but it was listed in one of our emails we got this week. And it was regarding 5 ways AI is impacting the wine trade. They have a few different things in here. They actually have some clips from Matt Crofton at Chateau Montelena, who we had on the podcast a while back, talking about how they're using it to crunch data that's coming in from the vineyards. I don't know if our listeners remember, but they had a lot of sensors throughout the data and in the winery, providing tons and tons of data. So they're using AI to help them understand that and really make the most out of what they're getting, which is cool. But the one I hadn't heard of before, and maybe I'm just behind the times, was for fraud prevention. So basically, there's a new AI tool that used gas chromatography, and they tested it in Bordeaux. And basically, they use it to detect specific chemical components of a wine that were distinct to the chateau where they were produced. So they took 80 wines, harvested over 12 years from 7 different estates, and were able to identify signatures for each of these chateaux just based on this gas chromatography. And they're saying that can be used moving forward. If somebody's saying this is a fake wine, you send it in, they do an analysis, and they can at least say if it came from that estate. And I guess maybe with carbon dating, how old it is. I thought that was really interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is cool. I was just thinking of what's the difference between AI in some of these contexts and then just like advanced data modeling
or technology. That is also something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sounds like what you're describing maybe on the fraud prevent. Like, yeah, I guess I can see how AI fits in there, and especially identity verification. But I was stuck on thinking about weather. Then maybe that would be a use case, taking the data that you have from weather in vineyards or even live footage via video, and somehow AI is able to give you back a better reading of what's going on in the climate, what could happen in the climate than traditional modeling could.
I will say that for the vineyard type technology, some of that, to your point, they are compiling it and giving you real-time data, but that they're also then creating suggestions that are saying, do this is what should be applied next, or like recommendations. So I think that makes some sense. For the fraud prevention, I'm not sure necessarily how that is AI right now, unless they're going to put this into a model that allows anybody to put something in and run it through. That's wishy-washy to me. But I will say that I think they're starting to use more things in the vineyard that are, to your point, could have just been technology triggered by something like smoke or like a certain weather thing triggering something that allows the counter action in the vineyard to happen. So I've heard of a vineyard recently basically installing almost an Iron Dome thing, like that missile defense thing Israel has, but for like fire defense. And they would basically shoot out things with like smoke retardant that would go and attack where the fire was. And I think that's somehow controlled by like an AI logical model. But yeah, no, I just thought that was interesting. More the concept rather than just the AI of, cool, is this the signature of this chateau? But then people may be working backwards and taking, these are just the components. Can I make these components at a lab and have something that tastes like it? I don't believe that'll ever be truly like possible, like exactly the same, but it's interesting that they're identifying specific components from specific chateau.
Yeah, we talked with Tastry in the past, who was doing AI in wine with consumer preferences. I think that's interesting. And then I think we've talked maybe a couple of times about AI in like consumer suggestions during web search or browsing on something like the Vint Marketplace. I think one where you think the most obvious use to me for an LLM would be something that could tap all of the critic reviews and all of the critic reviews, all of the tech sheets for a given wine, and could spit back in some kind of aggregation of those things. I don't know.
Yeah, no, 100%. As somebody who uses AI to make writing and different things like that type of data aggregation would be amazing. I'm manually putting these things in and getting them to synthesize them for me. But yeah, Tastry is mentioned in this article as well for their work with smoke taint. And then they talk about wine education as another possibility, is something like you were saying, or just like compiling all of the rules and regulations from around the world. If I had something right now that I could just like Google an AI model in one place that was accurate to study, that would be amazing. They also have winemaking, marketing and branding, and then also wine recommendations. So they touch on all the points that you mentioned on. This was on the drinks business if anybody wants to check it out. But then the second article that is on the Vint Marketplace, you could also read about this probably a lot because it was a fairly around the news, is Constellation is looking to exit completely from all wine business. I don't know if you've heard this yet. Have you?
No, I didn't see that.
So they had been selling off the lower end of their portfolio, and now Wine Business reported last week, and a few other people have followed up, I guess, on the same article, noting that they're exploring selling off the full wine portfolio. They would send part of it over to Duckhorn and Delicado.
Some of the biggest brands in Prisoner. Who else? Mondavi.
Yeah, they own Robert Mondavi, our good friends at Lingua Franca, Sea Smoke.
Oh, Kim Crawford, I see here actually. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, this is nothing to sneeze at, and it's interesting. Like Warren Buffett had just put like over $1 billion into Constellation, but I guess that was more on the promise of the beer side of their business, and possibly I think they're still invested in some of the cannabis side. I'm not sure, but I just thought that was very interesting, and I'm curious what that might mean for our friends at Lingua Franca or some of the people who had been acquired, if their models will change, or if anything that Constellation had implemented would be paused. So that was something interesting to me.
Yeah, that's right. They also have Booker and Schrader Double Diamond that we mentioned all these wines on the podcast at one point or another.
Yeah. So interesting times in the wine world. So people may not see a difference on their grocery store shelves, but a lot of the machinations going on in the background. So very exciting stuff. And speaking of more exciting things, I guess it's now time to get to talking about our guest for today. Is a great friend of the program. She's been on before, Mary Gorman-McAdams. She came on earlier, was it a year and a half, 2 years ago, just to talk about Bordeaux as a whole and the work that she had been doing with the Cru Bourgeois. And now she is writing a book on white Bordeaux that'll be coming out early next year. So we got to really dive deep into a topic that I personally wasn't as educated on. I am more now thanks to her. And she also touched on a little bit of the Cru Bourgeois news that we highlighted in the Vint Marketplace, as well as a little bit on the 2024 Bordeaux vintage, which will be going on Premier sale here in the spring.
Yeah, this is your Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon 101. If you're listening, especially like me, but also like Billy, who maybe just when you think of white wines that you're drinking week to week, white Bordeaux is wine that I'm just typically don't have a lot of in my cellar. I probably had less than 5, honestly, outside of Sauternes in my life. Definitely going to change that after this conversation, because I think what I walked away from what Mary said was like, hey, we should be thinking about some of these producers in a similar way that we maybe are starting to romanticize more and more white Rioja. Obviously, they have maybe a different wines, longer track record commercially, but these wines in Bordeaux are also to be taken seriously as well if you're looking at the right producer.
Yeah, what stood out to me the most was just the range of styles and the size of producers making white wine. I think maybe some collectors may be familiar with the wines coming out of Pessac-Léognan and Graves, but there's a lot she was talking about in the Entre-Deux-Mers, which I was unfamiliar with, and then a lot of producers experimenting with different cask types. So a lot of people may think of barrel-aged white Bordeaux, which is what the higher end typically is known for. But then she was talking about amphora, other vessels, big vessels, small, steel. So it really is everything from your everyday drinker all the way up through the wines you want to age for 10, 20 years plus. Really cool. I didn't really realize the range. And then she touches on sparkling some too. I feel like you brought it up in the interview, but it's almost like the Rioja conversation all again. It's not only are they doing all these cool things we didn't know about, but throw sparkling on top of that.
Yeah, the concrete amphora was something that I didn't really consider, which was cool to hear about in terms of some of their winemaking practice, and then just making the clear delineations between how Semillon behaves and how Sauvignon Blanc behaves in these wines, and separating them out into two components versus thinking, oh, white Bordeaux, and it's just like both of those together. I think she drew better distinctions about what you're getting when you purchase wines from these regions, and actually a ton of Semillon in their still wines. And yeah, it was cool to hear a little bit more about the diversity that I just assumed wasn't there for whatever bias reason.
Yeah. And one thing she briefly mentions, and I coincidentally spent the weekend learning about trunk diseases for my study purposes. Sauvignon Blanc is extremely susceptible to a lot of the trunk diseases that cause the vines to die. So without going into detail, that's what she kind of references, like people trying to decide what they want their blend to be in terms of wine, but also in the vineyard, what will last for a longer period of time. So the Semillon are much more resistant to some of these diseases than Sauvignon Blanc. So that also goes into people's calculations when figuring out what to plant and what they want in their vineyard. So I thought that was also interesting that she touched on that as well.
Very cool. Yeah. We just scratched the surface with Mary, an amazing guest, wealth of knowledge, doing a lot of great work. And I believe her White Bordeaux book coming out next year, 2026, I believe.
Yeah.
It's slated for spring 2026. So something to be on the lookout for. And I know she's going to do a great job, or is doing a great job with that project. Without further ado, before we get to our interview with Mary, remember to check out our online wine and spirits store at vintmarketplace.com, where you can find all of the cult classics from Bordeaux and some of the wines that we'll talk about here to Barolo, as well as niche producers that your favorite somms, like Billy, are drinking. With one of the largest selections of inventory in the U.S., some of the most competitive pricing for enthusiasts and collectors, the Vint Marketplace is your go-to shop for stocking your wine cellar. Without further ado, here's our interview with Mary Gorman-McAdams, Master of Wine.
All right, we are here with very special guest, Mary Gorman-McAdams, recurring guest of the Vint Podcast.
A friend.
Super to be here. Yes, we are friends. So I'm thrilled to be invited back. I guess that says I wasn't that much of a disaster the last time. So very, very happy to be here again talking to your listeners.
Of course. Yeah, no, your last episode was great. And I remember we went right up to the edge with so much to say that we had to have you back for a second round. And then when we were able to connect at seminar, I found out you were working on a really interesting book. So excited to hear a little bit about that, as well as the current happenings in Bordeaux right now. But first, do you want to give a little background on yourself, just quick for our listeners?
Yes, as listeners will probably realize, I'm Irish, but have been living in New York for 22 years. So I guess and I am an American now. And I am a Master of Wine. I became a Master of Wine in 2011. And I've been deeply involved in the Bordeaux region for, over 10 years now. Like anybody who is interested in wine or studying wine, Bordeaux is on their radar. And then in 2014, I worked with the Bordeaux wine region in a full-time capacity for about 5.5 years. And it was during that time that lots of areas that I felt were not getting sufficient airtime became really areas of interest for me, particularly the white wines. And that is something that was bubbling on my sort of back burner for a number of years, but I felt I couldn't really address the topic and write a book until I was no longer working for the region. So I'm totally independent now. I still work with some clients there, but the book is about all the white wines in the region, the history, because the history of white wines have been grown in Bordeaux for a very, very long time. And you often hear the popular sort of phrase, didn't you know that before the frost of 1957, there were more white grapes in Bordeaux than red? And that is true. But that was really an after World War II phenomenon. And then everybody went crazy planting red because red was more popular. Now there is a shift, and I think not enough has been said. A lot of very, very good wine books write something about the whites, but it's not spliced and diced as much as the red wines, and certainly understanding the terroir in relation to whites is less documented or understood. So that's really what I'm going after, and also really getting it under the skin of the Entre-Deux-Mers as well.
That's something I was going to ask. Do you want to touch on briefly the key varieties that are grown and maybe some unexpected ones for the whites, and then where they might be grown? Because I think everybody thinks of Pessac and Graves and Sauternes, but don't really think about Entre-Deux-Mers.
Yeah, and that's sort of kind of logical, because when you think about the renown of Bordeaux and the classifications, you have the 1855 classification of Sauternes, and the wines, they're magical, and they're not going away either. So I can talk a little bit about what's happening, not a little, a lot about what's happening there as well. And then we think of the wines of Pessac-Léognan, which often get a little bit muddled with Graves. In Graves is a very large area that's south of the city of Bordeaux, and the top area of it, which is quite small, is Pessac-Léognan. But Pessac-Léognan as an appellation was only created in 1987. So what you see, and I think this can often cause this confusion about Graves and Pessac, is that yes, it's within, so it's in many ways it's an appellation within an appellation. But in the 1950s, 1955, well, it took 55, 56, 57 before it was fully finalised, the classification of Graves. So all of the estates that were classified as Grand Cru Classé de Graves in 1955, 56 are all located very close together in Pessac-Léognan, in the northern Graves area. And that was one of the pieces of evidence to justify separating this out. And it's much more homogeneous. You do have the continuation of the gravelly outcrops of the Médoc, and you do have some limestone clay soils as well, where the white grapes are. But when you go further south into what is the larger Graves area, which is really quite beautiful, it's less homogeneous, and you have a lot more forests, or the pine forest coming in. So you have lots of lovely little vineyards that are in almost cutouts as you go all the way down to and around Sauternes and Barsac and even below it. And what is really clearly, I know one of your things you'd asked me was Graves and Pessac. There's much more Semillon. If you would say generally, what is the difference? The white wines of Pessac-Léognan are almost all exclusively, apart from the unreachable, expensive whites of Haut-Brion, where Semillon is at least half, if not dominant. But other than that, I can say categorically that all the wines, white wines of Pessac-Léognan, are driven by Sauvignon Blanc, with a little bit of, so either 60 and above, and many of them 70, 80, 90 and above. And in contrast, in Graves, more of the white wines have at least 50%, if not more, of Semillon. So there's more still of a tradition of Semillon. And there's all sorts of lore as to why that is. Traditionally, Semillon is higher yielding. Also, you can have great old vines with Semillon, but that's sadly not as celebrated in Bordeaux as it is in other regions. Sauvignon is more vulnerable to Esca. So it is, some would say, well, it's more expensive to cultivate Sauvignon than Semillon, but there's something wonderful about Semillon. But that's largely in terms of difference, and also typically because the soils give more intense wines overall in Pessac, you will tend to have the affinity with more barrel fermentation and a slightly bit more new oak in it than you would have in Graves.
Yeah,
Sorry?
No, yeah, I said as you move farther down to the region, you get into Sauternes, as you mentioned. I think most collectors, enthusiasts, maybe folks who are buying wine for their cellar are obviously thinking of the famous wines and the sweet wines that we know from there. What's the occasion, if you could just put it succinctly, what's the occasion for the wines that you're describing here in terms of how do they fit into maybe sort of like the food and social culture of the region, and how might collectors, enthusiasts think about buying them for their cellar if they do?
And also, before you go, let's clarify too. You're talking about mostly the dry white wines of Bordeaux too. I just want to make sure we're all very clear on that. Yeah.
And when you get down to that Sauternes and Barsac, there is an increasing amount of dry white being made. I would say all, or certainly 95+% of the classified estates in Sauternes make a dry white or several dry white wines. And many of the smaller estates also make some dry white wines. That does not mean that the Vin Liqueurs are going anywhere. My sort of take on spending time there and spending time with the estates is that there is focus on having the right balance of the sweet wines, but also their gros vin is just getting better and better. So there's almost in tandem, there is this focus on dry white. Like I think for one example, Chateau Clémence, when the new owners bought it, part of the strategy was they discontinued the second sweet wine, a Vin Liqueurs. And they now have a fabulous range of dry whites, but they still, the crown jewel of the estate is still the Grand Vin Liqueurs, the sweet Chateau Clémence. So that is a huge focus. And also you may see as you go around in the US that there is a focus by the chateau owners of Sauternes to get more Sauterne on the table and people enjoying Sauterne with meals. I know certainly one of the strategy at Yquem is they want it Yquem by the glass in the top 40 restaurants in the top 40 cities around the world. And really that it is a food wine and very underpriced, even the real top Sauterne wines relative to their counterparts in other grape wine regions are still so inexpensive. And these wines are indestructible. They age forever. And I'm sure you've both had very old Sauterne. It's the actual sweetness doesn't change, but the impression of sweetness changes. And you have that with a slow cooked sort of stew or game or with so many dishes. It's just absolutely a gorgeous wine to pair. And relative to the other great wines, I still think very affordable.
And so if you think about these drier white wines, it's maybe for some enthusiasts a little bit harder to place it, how it fits into the way that they think about buying wines from the region. Especially I'm thinking folks who have a cellar, right? It's easy for them to go and buy Sauternes, which they know is going to last for, like you said, it's indestructible. Yeah, how might someone think about purchasing these drier white wines and how they fit into sort of the life of a wine drinker, maybe?
I think if we're talking specifically about the dry whites of Sauterne, there is a great diversity because you have everything from the Jet de Guiraud, which you can buy for $20, to which is a very, very different wine. And my last visit there in November, thankfully, I was treated to some lovely older vintages, and that is a wine with incredible depth, incredible presence, incredible just texture and aging ability. But what you're seeing, there's a lot of things going on. I think it's still a little bit in terms of dry, work in progress. But now you're seeing with Guiraud, they have a Grand Vin Blanc sec, and they will still have their Jet de Guiraud. So what I'm seeing is that where they're making a dry white, and there was a difference in sort of style, that particularly among the great Chateau Sauterne, more of them or most of them are now going towards, yes, I might have a sort of a ready to wear, but I'm really want to make a Grand Vin Blanc sec as well in this, not the same spirit, but in the same sort of quality bucket as, say, an Yquem or some of the other great white wines. So that's certainly something that I'm seeing is looking at finding the particular terroir that would give them that great dry white wine. So yeah, collectors, I wouldn't say just watch the space, get in there and try, because these wines are kind of children in a way now. So get to know them as they're evolving. But that's certainly my last visit in November was, they've all got 2 at least dry white wines. And there's certainly the crown jewel, their Grand Vin Blanc sec, and then one or maybe some other wines that are also there to be there for other consumption occasions, more kind of your Monday night wine or whatever.
Yeah, our most recent podcast, we were talking in the region of Rioja. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about white Rioja, which may be making a resurgence. Obviously, great varieties used there that maybe have a presence in the market of more longevity, and they can maybe age for longer. And so that was what the basis of the question came about, was as people dive in. That was a great answer.
And also it's Semillon. So Semillon has great age potential. And
that's right.
Sauvignon, let's look at sort of Pavillon Blanc, which is 100% Sauvignon. So in the right terroir, the right age, cultivated the right way, you can still have great white wines that are not necessarily Semillon. But Semillon is the backbone of more of the great dry white wines.
So I guess not to harp on this for too long, but so for the top wines, how long would you say those would develop well? Like, I guess, what would the prime drinking window be for some of those? And maybe how would that compare to, say, something from Pouilly-Fumé or like some of the other top Sauvignon Blanc based wines that people would think of? And then maybe some of the Entre-Deux-Mers, would that compare more to like a Touraine or like maybe a New Zealand style, not style, but drinking window type deal?
Okay, a lot of questions there. In terms of the drinking window, I would very safely say you got a good 20 years for the good wines. And after that, then it's up to you whether you like that sort of more evolved, more predominantly evolved character in the wine, or whether your preference is still to have that sort of vivaciousness and brightness. And certainly there are wines that can go longer, but then you're into it a bit more of bottle variation, depending on its sort of distribution circuit as well, it could change. But I would definitely say safely for those wines, you've easily got a good 20, 25 years.
And that's when Semillon is by far the majority of the blend, correct?
Well, Pavillon Blanc, or certainly if you've got, it starts with if you've got a good terroir that can really express that, not just intensity, but density in the wine as well. You can, with wines that have a good dollop of Sauvignon Blanc as well. To me, they can still get a good 20 years.
I think what I'm realizing as you're saying this, that I have a bias towards thinking about Sauvignon Blanc is just drink it now, right? And so that's why I'm like feeling so stuck on this, because so you're giving really good information here, I think, for our listeners to break a bias that I'm sure exists. If I have the bias, I'm sure it exists out there.
There is a bias. And also I think there's even more of a bias when it comes to the Entre-Deux-Mers. Last year, on one of my trips to Bordeaux, I was at this gorgeous little estate that I love, Chateau Tully. It's in La Sauve, in the middle of the Entre-Deux-Mers. And it's interesting because her dad, it's Sylvie and her sister Marie who run the estate now. And their father, Francis, was a big sort of advocate for white. And they have half their estate is white, which is unusual. Carbonier is a bit like that, but here we're in the Entre-Deux-Mers. But when I was there, she said, Mary, I'm going to bring out some old wines, because she also says that people, the vigneron themselves as well, you go visit in the Entre-Deux-Mers and they show you the latest vintage. So they almost propagate that image of, as we might say, sort of a porch pounder, or she would say a vin de piscine, but that the Entre-Deux-Mers whites are more than that. So not only did we go back sort of 15 years, and then she said, let me go and bring you out something else. And she brought out a 1984 Chateau Tully Entre-Deux-Mers, so Blanc Sec. It was hopping. It was lovely. She did preface saying, okay, every bottle of 84 that they have still is not equally as good, it's a little bit hit or miss, but she was prepared to take the chance with me. It was gorgeous. Really, really, really lovely. And I do think then the Entre-Deux-Mers, unless the wine has really been made in a way that's just get it out there, and this is actually something I've been struggling with, because I've always hated the term that people often say, generic Bordeaux. I'm saying there's no such thing. It's regional. But I'm now coming around to the sort of belief that there's actually both. And if you're a very quality conscious estate in the Entre-Deux-Mers, or in the great sort of areas that are AOC Bordeaux, and you're an estate and you're quality conscious, I think you're making a regional wine. If you're just pumping out a volume brand, then it's fair to say maybe you're making something that is a generic representation. You want it quick in and quick out. But there are an awful lot more, I think, of the regional expressions within the Entre-Deux-Mers. And the Entre-Deux-Mers is interesting because it is this undulating rolling hills, but it basically has a lot of limestone. Now, it has outcrops as you go over towards the right, heading towards the Dordogne, Grisiac, where you do have the hard starfish limestone and exposed hard limestone. But you really have this enormous amount of molasse or argilo-calcaire with a greater or lesser levels of limestone, but a lot of limestone and this great freshness. So there are really a lot of great white terroirs in the Entre-Deux-Mers, where you're going to get freshness and also intensity. And I think you're seeing people moving back, and there's certainly a lot of great producers have always focused on their whites. But I think as we're seeing a reorganizing of the Bordeaux vineyard to deal with overproduction, that we will see more of a focus on white, and whites being a great focus and understood in the really good terroirs for the whites, which you find absolutely in the Entre-Deux-Mers. You find on the right bank as well, parts of Blaye, Franck, Castillon, where again you have that continuation of the plateaus. I think it's an exciting time to be making white. And the Médoc, you may or may not be aware that there is an appellation, Médoc Blanc, coming down the tracks. It's all been approved and everything. And I think the rule book, as they call the Cahier des Charges, will, if it's not ready for 2025 vintage, it will be ready for the 2026. So there is a huge interest in white again.
Wow. And there's also a growing amount of Cremant, the Bordeaux being made as well.
And I worry that's growing too fast. I was talking to a small vigneron this morning in a little area in the kind of the north, middle towards east of the Entre-Deux-Mers, and he was telling me last year he made 11,500 bottles of Cremant, the year before 6,000, the year before 4,000. Yeah, it's now about, I think, over 3% of all the wine produced in Bordeaux, and it's about 8 or 9% of all the white wine. So it is really growing. And actually, I was talking to a few producers in the last week about Cremant, trying to wrap my head around where it fits, because certainly here in the United States, you don't see many independent sort of Chateau Cremants, Cremant de Bordeaux. You see some of the big brands. And a few producers in Bordeaux have elected with their Cremant or their sparkling wine not to use the designation Cremant, but to use Vin de France, because they feel that the quality perception is not capped. Then I'm talking to other producers have a different view, because there seems to be less of a psychological cap on the quality of Cremant in some European countries. So it's still playing out, but certainly it is growing. And I do hope it continues. I do also worry that it's growing a little too fast, but we will see.
Yep. Sorry about that. No, that's really cool. I think about this actually ties back into our Rioja conversation, talking about the sort of resurgence of sparkling, or not resurgence, but coming back into sort of the mainstream market, sparkling wines. And curious, same grape varieties. Is there different sort of standard class
preferences? Because you probably know with sparkling wine, it's a fairly big investment to enable this sort of entirage. Right. So you do have the giants and some major players and the co-ops, and then you have a sort of there's about 8 of them that are called the elaborateurs. So the people who have the facilities to put en tirage the wine. So independent, a bit like in Germany, the Winzersekt. You grow your grapes, you make your Vin Clair, and then you work with an elaborateur who will enable you to put it on tirage, and they will age the wine for you. And I've rambled off your question as to the grape variety. Yes, there are very different viewpoints. There are some say, don't touch this variety, don't touch the other variety. Some elaborateurs just say, no, they should all be Blanc de Noir. It's really Cabernet Franc. If people say never Merlot, it's too soft. Then you have people who make lovely Merlot. You have people say never touch Sauvignon. And I do have this memory of tasting. It was back, I think, in either 2011 or something like that, when New Zealand had a glut, and out came this Cabernet Sauvignon Blanc, which thankfully is a distant memory. But because when you render something sparkling, you're going to amplify what's in it. So with the teals in Sauvignon Blanc, that can be sometimes an issue. At the same time, it is allowed up to 20% in the white Cremant. And I've tasted some, and it's actually quite lovely. You don't have this overpoweringness of Sauvignon Blanc. But mainly, I would say Semillon and Cabernet Franc. I spoke to a wine grower yesterday, and for his rosé, he uses Malbec because he likes the sort of vivacity of it, the energy. He likes the color. It just gives it a little bit of nice color for the rosé, the sort of fruitiness. So it really is whatever. I think I would say probably although Jacques Lurton in that lovely new range, he has Diane there, and it's a Vin de France, is 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. I know a lot of people say that they don't particularly like Cabernet Sauvignon. So it depends. I grew up in a farming background, and my dad always said, it depends. There's what works for me on your terroir. But I would say overall, probably Semillon and Merlot would probably, and Cabernet Franc would be the varieties that you most come across having been used for the Cremant.
And for speaking, it made me think of this when talking about the red Cremant. For like the still rosés in the region, Cabernet Franc dominates.
It's a mixture. There are certainly plenty of strong views that Cabernet Franc makes a much more interesting, lively. That Merlot can be a little bit mou, a little bit soft. Often they would keep Merlot for Claret. But you do find all sorts. You find blends as well. And the rosé I think rosé is getting better. White wine is a much more technical wine to make than red wine. There is nowhere to hide that you can, not saying that you can hide making a red wine, but certainly with white wine, any faults are more easily exposed. And when it comes to rosé, even more, which again, it poses the question why, when you see Bordeaux rosé out there, people tend to price it even lower than their white. But certainly in making Bordeaux rosé, the rules allow you, like they do in the south of France and many places, to include up to a certain proportion of white varieties. but nobody does, because there's whatever little value is attributed to the white wines of Bordeaux, there's even less value in terms of the perception attributed to the rosé wine. So
Sure.
nobody's waste their, not to waste, but they're not going to put white grapes into a rosé wine that they will end up selling more
Third
cheap
of the price. Yeah.
to a white
Yeah.
wine.
Yeah.
But I think in the white wine, if I have a minute, so with what I do love and I see is the growing up and the maturing of winemaking, in the sense of no longer. I think back when coming out of that sort of glut of the 1950s and 60s, that wines were white winemaking know-how wasn't where it is today, and the wines were not necessarily made. They were made using red wine know-how. So the need to be a little bit more reductive and protect the wine along the way was not necessarily to the fore. And then came in the 90s, the late Professor Denis Dubourdieu and all the work that he did. And then that almost became a rule. Whereas you see now everybody's much more comfortable in their skin and making their own decisions with regard to whether or not to do a skin contact for any length of time, the managing a little bit maybe more higher levels of turbidity, not being scared of a little bit of oxygen, but at the same time wanting to preserve the integrity and beauty of the varieties and the sort of the fruit character. And then everyone has their own view on yeast. Even people, you think strictly mallow, but there are people who don't mind if a lot decides to go through mallow. That's okay too, particularly in a cooler vintage, although there's not so many of those. So either really, and then in terms of vessels as well, and then time on lees as well. There's a lot more understanding of how you don't mess up the quality of the sort of the raw material as you go the whole process.
Yeah, that was something. Well, speaking of process, just to clarify for everyone, Cremant has to be traditional method. So all of that is
hand harvested. It has to be whole bunch pressed. It has to be bottle fermented. Absolutely. And there's no rule about reserve wines. I think there's very few regions outside of Champagne who have the inventory of reserve wines. So even if the vintage is not stated on the Cremant at the Bordeaux, it will almost like 100% be of a single vintage.
Interesting. And then last bit here on the vessels for the white wines, are you seeing a range of stainless and barrel across like price points? Or are you seeing mostly barrel and any new oak? Are there new oak on the top wines and then there's less as it goes down? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any real correlation with price point.
Okay.
I'm seeing a great mix of shapes and sizes. I'm moving away from just one. I think if you're stainless steel, what you've absolutely seen is a move away from tall to shorter, less tall and wider. So in terms, particularly when you're stirring the lees, that it's a much easier to get more contact with the lees and build that texture. But people have, for fermenting and also for aging, in terms of oak, it's lots of different sizes. You're finding Austrian oak in places, you're finding larger food or just 300 litres or 500 litres. So there really is a confidence in working out what kind of works for me. And I think what is, again, is you find people doing the opposite as well. But what you often see, because the style of a white Bordeaux, because of that beautiful sort of fruit that they're trying to preserve, but yet build that complexity and texture, if it's in a bar, is to start the fermentation in tank, and then after it gets going, maybe day 2, then to move it into barrel. And there's also a sort of thinking now that after the barrel aging about 9 months, if you want to leave it longer on the lees, to put it back into a tank and let it continue there, because after the sort of 9 months on the lees, the sort of protective properties of the lees has gone. So then you're going to start, because if you stay in oak, you're going to start to lose some of that brightness of the fruit purity. Again, within that, there are people, depending on their own philosophy of the style they're making, will make their own decisions. You have also concrete. I spoke to a guy this morning who makes his white in concrete and fiberglass, and they're organic, biodynamic. It doesn't add anything, likes good turbidity. So really, what is lovely is to see the individualism, and I think that is not really appreciated when people talk about white Bordeaux, and certainly once they go away from Pessac-Léognan, they feel it's just this one kind of easy drinking, fruity wine that's made quickly, and it is not at all.
Yeah, you took it right from me. I was going to ask about concrete, and you categorize it as sort of like would you say like an individual, or maybe something a little bit on the fringe? Is it on the fringe or?
No, you use concrete a lot. Old concrete as well as new, and obviously eggs, and the old globe is in there too. It's lovely. You go to some small little estates like that are a bit like sheds, and you see the mix of shapes and sizes, amphora they have and everything. So what is so lovely that the experimentation is not just the preserve of the great chateau. You see these, you could be going through the Loire or Burgundy, all of these wonderful wine growers who are trying things, and they're deciding, working out what works and what doesn't work.
This is going to be probably pretty ignorant. Both of you can jump on me. But I've seen pictures, like I think maybe in Portugal, Spain, like open fermentation in concrete, like troughs or open vats like that. Is that a practice in other regions outside of what?
Of course, with white. For red, where you want to have oxygenation.
For the reds, yeah.
Top fermenters, yeah. But for the whites, no, there still is about just keeping a certain amount of protection and not having too much oxygen so that you actually do preserve the brightness of the fruit.
Brady, were you talking about like literally like lagars, like where people foot stomp things and those like shallow granite things?
Yeah, well, yeah, I guess really shallow troughs. But I know that that's mainly the red wines. And I assume the wines in Bordeaux where we're talking about, maybe like you mentioned, a little bit too delicate to be exposed to that much.
Well, white, yeah, you do certainly with reds have, they don't, I haven't come across anyone that still has, or has sort of the lagar type open fermenter. Sure. I think I may even have seen years ago in the sort of the Museum of L'Anchepage that something akin to that. But no, they have facilities for opening them. You have lots of the old.
I'm 300 years late, maybe something like this.
I bet you do have the lovely walls of old concrete that certainly are more appreciated or reappreciated again.
Cool. Well, I think that's moving on to red wine talk here a little bit. Let's pivot over to the Cru Bourgeois and some of those updates. We featured it in the Vint Marketplace news last week. I believe there's just like a shakeup of who's classified, how many people are classified in the top levels as this continues to kind of get its footing. I actually first met you when you were doing a talk for the Cru Bourgeois, so I think there's nobody else better to ask about the updates.
I think this year, I heard a lot of people, wow, well, let me think about this. Yeah, so the new classification, the Cru Bourgeois, which is now, it is a classification that has continued to evolve since its inception. And it is now a 5-year renewable classification and is now sort of has 3 tiers. The last one, which was 2018, there were like, I think 250 or 247 estates, to be precise, properties that were classified in, and then you had this sort of 3 tiers. This year, there are 160. So that's a big 80 less chateau in the classification this year. There's still the same number of, so the 3 layers are Cru Bourgeois, and then there's Cru Bourgeois Supérieur, and then Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel. There is the same blind tasting, so you have to submit 5 vintages of, I think it's of a window of 7 for the blind tasting. That blind tasting is what gets you into being a Cru Bourgeois. And then Supérieur and Exceptionnel, there are additional requirements regarding to how you farm, bit like in 1855, how well known you are you out there in the marketplace. So they are not the first, and neither was Saint-Emilion the first to bring in this sort of commercial aspect. That's been around since the 1855 classification. There are still 14 Grand Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel, but they're not the same 14. There's only, I think, 3 that remained. It is interesting. There's lots of ways of splicing and dicing what happened. Certainly, I think things that are fact. One thing I think that has been touted that I don't think necessarily is fact, because in the previous classification, you were supposed to be on the way to having an environmental certification. And now you have to have it. I don't think that deterred anybody, because Bordeaux has really moved ahead. And And then certainly when you're in the Médoc, when you break down the appellations, it really is at least 80, 85, 95% of the estates in the appellations, not going into the classifications, have a classifications. I don't know, but I doubt if that was a deterrent. Certainly there are hard times. And when you look at the hard times in Bordeaux at the moment that people are struggling commercially, people say, oh, it's the Entre-Deux-Mers. Certainly there are areas in the Entre-Deux-Mers, in the Côte in Blaye, but also in the Médoc, in the Haut-Médoc and Northern Médoc areas. So the economic reality, because it costs money to not only go through a classification process, but you have to pay your dues. And maybe you think then, well, am I getting any value from this? And then there's the cynic in me that also looks at that maybe its value is in a way to something else. So you've probably heard some of the, certain estates have left like Lille-na-Douai. Well, maybe it doesn't need it anymore. If you remember back, there's some fantastic estates in the Médoc that used to be in the Cru Bourgeois back in 2003, like Phil and Ségur. They're so secure and so well established and known that I would say, like, why would they need a Cru Bourgeois classification? At the same time, I look at, there are a few estates that I've seen really, really grow. Two estates I would mention in particular are Château Palumet, which is a fabulous little estate near Loudun in the Haut-Médoc, and it's owned by this gorgeous guy. You have to meet him sometime, Pierre Cazeneuve, who is just, have him on the show. He is just amazing. He'll never stop talking. When he took over from his mom, he really, he's very much into regenerative viticulture. He is certified organic, but he has trees and he's got everything in his vineyard. But he has really brought the estate from not being part of it to being Cru Bourgeois Supérieur, and now Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel. And also there's another estate in Margaux called Montgravis that you may have come across, which is a very new estate. The owners, Gis and his wife, Karine Bernelot, Régis. He knew a lot of people. He basically pieced together little plots here and there and created, I don't know exactly when, but we're not going back longer than 30 years. I think it was in the 80s, an estate. And it's beautiful. And then he brought it to Cru Bourgeois level, Cru Bourgeois Supérieur, and that's now Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel. So it's great to see maybe it motivates people and to pull themselves up to this level. And then maybe it comes a point that, like Angelus and Cheval Blanc leaving Saint-Emilion, they don't necessarily need it. But then you could also argue that by leaving, they're taking something with them that helped them, and maybe they should stay and be loyal to this. So there's both sides. It would be a great MW question, Billy, to force people to look at the reasons on all sides for why it has dropped and the sort of the value of the Cru Bourgeois.
Yep, I could see that one being one where you don't have to come down with a solid opinion, but you have to have examples to back up both sides.
Yeah.
I will have to ask, I think it's the question a lot of people would be asking just from the outside as a consumer collector point of view. How do these wines compare to some of the wines that are classified in the 1855 classification? Are there's certainly ones that aren't performing as well as their ranking would say in the one, and then maybe overperformers in the other. How would you say that those two compare?
Yeah, in terms of consumers, I think something having a tag it can be helpful to help people navigate a wine region where there are a lot of names and you may not necessarily know who's who. So they can help you do a first triage. In terms of where they sit in relation to the 1855, well, I think you could absolutely, there is no dispute that the top 1855 classified estates are the top because they are the top. And I truly believe if they do very little, the potential of the terroir is so great that they will always produce great wine. The same, I think, as you go down through the 1855 list, there are certainly some estates that I think certainly the top Cru Bourgeois wines could face off on very good footing. Yeah, I do, and I think for many, just having the classification, and it matters in some markets more than others. No, I haven't spent time in the Asian market, but I understand from people there that having a classification, the Cru Bourgeois kind of holds sway more in Asia than maybe it necessarily does here. And I think it depends on the market, depends on the customer, whether or not having a classification is something important, and it helps them feel secure about the wine. But yeah, absolutely. I would say there are definitely Cru Bourgeois estates that are still there at the top, and certainly some that have recently left that definitely could hold sway against fourth growths, some fifth growths, and maybe even some third growths. But I certainly think when you're going down the rather necessarily the second wine or sometimes the third wine, I think it's worth looking at the Cru Bourgeois category.
Very nice. You trying to step up and take a 10,000 foot shot. When were you last in Bordeaux, like on the ground with winemakers down there?
November.
In November. Okay, so you're sort of coming out of the harvest and wanting to get your perspective on the 2024 vintage, since obviously you were there and got to, I'm sure, speak with a lot of winemakers. Maybe give us the rough overview of.
Yeah, we'll do it. I was there like 4 times last year. I was there in April when, like, driving across from Saint-Emilion back to the left bank, you could see all the smoke from the smudge pots because there was some frost. And then having some Bordeaux friends here in sort of October, and they panicking and like being really stressed out, and then going back and say, sorry, I was in such bad humor. Suddenly something magic happened in the tank, and it's not as bad as I thought, or showing me, oh my God, I'm not even getting 11% of my Cabernet potential alcohol. So it was a really, really challenging year. It was probably the weather-wise, the wettest winter since before 2000. I think the wettest September in about 30 years. There was just so much rain. It wasn't one of the coldest growing seasons, but it certainly was one where there was an awful lot of rain. Flowering, actually, there was a little respite, and flowering was actually very successful, but then came more, not even so much rain, but humidity, and that sort of not terribly cold but humid weather. So fruit set was not good, and particularly Merlot, which is very susceptible to the humidity during fruit set, was badly affected. And then the sort of the rainy, damp weather. So mildew pressure was very, very high all throughout that early spring and coming into summer. I remember being there in June, and I was like, it was chilly. I was expecting to, certainly at the weekend, to be able to kick back and enjoy some nice warm weather. It wasn't. But the sun came out middle of July until literally the last week in August was a beautiful summer. So that really helped. But was it enough? And then almost always in Bordeaux, you get a lovely Indian summer. But what they got, the wettest September that they've ever had. It was very challenging. But what challenging now means, rather than what it meant years ago, is more affecting quantity. So the quantity is even way lower than it was in 2023. But again, it will depend. So the wines are not going to be big. They're not going to be powerful. But that window of summer should bring some loveliness to a nice sort of fruit. And you've got to be out managing your canopy. And this was not the summer to be shading. This was open it all up. Let's amplify the sunshine here for the time we have it. But the Bordelais now, they know that they can't go off and just let things happen. So they're in their vineyards more often. And again, it's anecdotal. It's not a complete survey. I've heard from several people tell me that they lost 10, 15, 20, 30, 40% of their crop in 2023. 2024, there was higher mildew pressure and they didn't, but they were out there. They were treating their vines. I would say treating, not chemicals. People are using organic treatments. Again, that posed the question, you're out there in your tractor, you're using fuel, although there are some people with electric tractors now. So there's all sorts of questions there in the greater sustainability discussion. So I think we will see. In terms of the reds, they're not going to be blockbuster. They're not going to be big and powerful. But those that were attentive should produce some, I think, lovely wines. We will see. I'm really looking forward to trying them going back out in April. And again, it's a bit of putting on your farmer, putting on your brave face. But some friends I know very well who are not trying to impress me and pretend have said that they were very pleasantly surprised with how the wines progressed as they were vinifying. So we will see. They're the collector market who sometimes is looking for perfection and this great, are they going to be the most age-worthy wines? No, but you don't kick your child out of your house if it's not the strongest of all your kids. You look for the beauty there. So we will see. But a great year for white and also for the Van Leeuwen, because what has been happening with the, I guess, warmer vintages is that, so I don't know, the sweet wines, the great sweet wines, is that you have a lot of, what would you say, late ripeness, so still maturity before botrytis comes. So you get these very big, rich wines. And ideally, in turn, you want botrytis to come early before you have too much to mature. So you get that liveliness and sort of freshness. So all of that complexity is coming more purely from botrytis than the late harvest ripening. So I think this year we'll see that you didn't have that to maturity. And botrytis came, and it came nicely. It augurs well for the great sweet wines and also for the dry whites. Again, obviously, because you could preserve that little bit of acidity, that sort of window of sort of 6 weeks of summer was lovely. So that will have brought nice ripeness to the white wines, and we will see. But I think the whites will really be lovely, and the sweets will be great. And I am looking forward to the reds with more modest alcohol, shall we say. And obviously there will have been some chaptalization this year that really had to have gone out of being used because it wasn't needed. But yeah, after this sort of the slew of warm, hot drought vintages, this is another wake-up call that every vintage is more different than it used to be in the past.
It'll be interesting to see the prices too. But and back to yields, I think I read that there was the lowest yield since like 1991. How much of that do you think was just based on like mildew pressure versus people trying to produce less, or any of the pull-up scheme that might be coming to effect?
Yeah, I don't think anyone's trying to produce less. But I think it's a really interesting question because when you look at across the app, when you look at the overall region, the average yield for 24 was like 35 hectolitres per hectares, which was even 2 less than last year. I think it was like 37 or something like that. And then when you dig more deeply to the appellations, you find the appellations that suffer the most are Bordeaux, AOC Bordeaux, and Bordeaux Superior. And part of that is to be expected because more of the wines will be more predominantly Merlot, and they tend to lose the most because maybe they don't have the resources to be out in their vineyard as much. They were, I know I have it written down, they would have been quite low I think last year they were 25 or 26 hectolitres a hectare. White was good, white was solid, and we're talking about between around 50 hectolitres per hectare. But I always smile to myself when some wine students, and they seem committed, or convinced that they are producing like 65 hectolitres a hectare, or that is a big issue. I'm thinking, forget about yields. Mother Nature has taken care of that in every wine region at this stage. It's just a piece of data on a rule book, but it doesn't really come into play. When you look at, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I was talking about old vines, how when you're in Bordeaux, there are some old vines, but they're not celebrated as much, or talked about or highlighted. You come across them and they just say, well, yeah, we're only going to pull it up. But you find some of these are yielding sort of 10 hectolitres per hectare, which is not necessarily a bad thing if it is of great quality. Often they say, well, it was planted on SO4, so it really isn't generating anything of quality either. But yeah, yields are down. And obviously the pulling up scheme kind of factors into that. But then also the increase in vineyards being declared for Cremant brings it up, because Cremant, you can get what you're getting. The average of Cremant would have been 57 or up to 60 hectolitres a hectare, because they're being harvested earlier as well, and they were less affected by mildew. So it depends, but yeah, overall, basically the amount of wine being produced is down. And actually 2024 is the first year that the hectares declared is under 100,000. It's 94,000 and something. So that's another big drop. Or should we say maybe a realigning to where the natural order of things. I don't think that the region is going to disappear. I think possibly when going back 20, 30 years, there was too much expansion too fast, and everybody, let's plant more. And then now there's a realigning that perhaps you can't sell wine into every single beverage consumption opportunity that some of the marketeers might have thought in the past. I feel confident about Bordeaux. I think could be a realigning, and what's there will be better.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave off here. Thank you so much again for joining us, Mary. And I'm excited to see the book. When do you think it's going to be completed and out there?
I'm really excited to see it. Chapters are coming out slowly. It's not an easy thing writing a book, particularly when it's your first book. And the more you get into it, the more you realize that, wow, there's a lot. Because I don't want a book that ChatGPT could just generate. So there's a lot of footwork and getting a lot of personal interviews and visits and information from people so I can piece together a view. Yeah, my editor is the Classic Wine Library, which is part of l'Académie du Vin Library, and I am due to have the full manuscript in by the end of September. Hopefully that will happen, and then they're hoping to, between back and forth and editing, to get it out there in the spring, just in time for the white wine season to kick off and the rosé season. That's the goal.
Perfect. Well, thanks again. And a year from now, we'll keep an eye out for the book.
Super. So thank you so much, Billy and Brady. Lovely as ever to talk to you, and have a lovely rest of the day. Take care.
All right. That was our interview with friend of the program, Mary Gorman-McAdams. I hope everybody goes and checks out some Bordeaux Blanc now. And again, check out our new title, the Vint Wine Podcast, and leave us 5 stars if you haven't yet. We appreciate all the listeners, and we're excited for this new chapter under our new name. But for now, that is our episode for this week, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.